an archaeologist. I've been an archaeologist in the normal way, and often archaeologists are scientists who want to tell the whole story, the whole scientific story of an excavation. And by being a guide also, I noticed that there are specific stories that are a common interest for a much broader public than just experts.
When you're in a museum at night, those paintings are there as well, but everything is sleeping. Everything is dead. When it opens the museum in the morning and people come in, things start to live. And when you tell stories about these works of art, then it becomes more than just a painting, more than just a sculpture.
I think that the most important thing about storytellings is that gives life to things and to history, because we are used to see history as something written on the page of a book and not as something that we can feel in the body, that we can imagine as a daily life, or the daily life of a Roman emperor. It's something that through storytelling can be done, and the people remembers it way better than anything else written on a book.
And what storytelling, oral storytelling, which I'm talking about here, can do is to give life to experiences and give authenticity to them. I mean, film and literature are very good in recording heritage and culture, but it's not a personal voice speaking. What a storyteller can do is to give a voice and body to experience.
In our museum, we present the story of 25,800 Jews, Roma and Sinti, who were deported from Belgium to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And the storytelling is very important in the way that we present these individuals. So we want to capture their individual stories and we want to remember them. So telling their story in itself is a part of the heritage assignment that we as a Holocaust museum have.
In Finland, we have really great archives. It's like packed with stories and fragments of old written or sung poems. And what storytelling does today is bringing those alive again, because they are there under the dust, and then some storytellers might go there and dig and dig and dig, and bringing something what was told before, bring it again for today, and maybe make a new constellations of finding old fragments and putting them together with a different way they have done before.
As beautiful as modern architecture can be, the historical sites and places are amazing for storytellings. What the storytelling performance can give to the site receives in return in terms of energy, of beauty of the place, of when a place has history, you believe in it. It's stronger. And this is why if you tell a Roman story in a Roman amphitheater, it's way, way stronger than told in a conference hall with aluminium and chairs and the classical white wall.
What I try to do as a storyteller is not to be didactical in the first place, but telling Boccaccio, which I will do tomorrow for the first time. I'm reading a book about the 14th century, a very interesting book I read 40 years ago. I'm rereading it, and so that means that I can use information I get out of that book to put it into my show, not necessarily to put it into the stories I tell, but to put the stories into how do you say, een kader, into a composition, so that the story becomes not only a fantasy, a fictive story, but that it's placed in a reality, which I explore from that other book. And people can listen and say, oh, yeah, that's right, this was reality, and in that context, in this reality, somebody, a writer, Boccaccio, wrote his stories.
Our collection is very diverse. In our archives we have both objects and testimonies of, for example, Jewish camp survivors. These in themselves are just rough materials. They don't get any meaning before they are placed in a museum and they go into dialogue with an audience. So using the heritage to transform a general story of the Holocaust into a personal story which talks to the visitor, that is one of the main goals that we want to achieve with these archival collections. Purposes we want these heritage items to serve.
So stories are born around us. If there are 1,000 people, I think there is maybe 100 stories being told that very night. And of these, maybe 20 stories are still alive next week. And maybe there is one story of such significance as the Rustam story that will be told in 100 years from now. Because it's not talking about a certain person, it's talking about our time or our existence. And this is how stories are born and travel through humanity. And I mean, us performers, we are telling stories that are, I have stories from ancient Greece, for instance, ancient Egypt, where I find significance. They were told thousands of years ago and they still speak these stories, because the stories are some kind of container where human experience is put down. And it's a brilliant container which can travel light from generation to generation.
I went to Scotland, to Edinburgh, to an international storytelling festival. And of course I learned in the university that folk tales are everywhere around the world, but I only heard these tales in Hungarian. And I was sitting there in the audience and two Scottish guys told a story about two men are fighting on the last piece of steak. And there is a funny joke at the end. I will not tell the story now. But when the performance was finished, I went to the storytellers and I asked, "Oh, how did you get that story? Because I have it from Hungary and I thought it's a Hungarian story." And he said, and he was a Scottish man, "I heard it from an Arabic person." So, and that was a wow moment, or how do you call it, when you realize that yes, it's our common heritage. The difference is, yes, it's told, stories are told in other languages and you can play with the structure, with the rhythm of the language. That's also beautiful, and that's a unique thing, I could tell, because every language is different and unique. But behind this beautiful uniqueness, or how do you say it, behind it there is a more worldwide culture, which I think it's really beautiful how these two elements and backgrounds can meet.
I think stories become heritage when people have them inside, because heritage is also oral heritage, and so if people remembers the story that they have been telling or listening to, this is a part of the heritage. And the other part is that when you walk through a city, you can see just the buildings, or you can say, here this happened, and you know the story. And this is completely different. It's make the place yours because you know the story. It's like we storytellers, we used to say, if you know the story of someone, you cannot but love him. And it's the same for heritage and the historical places.
As an archaeologist, I'm used to work with material stuff. They don't speak, that's often told so, but when you use an object, you know that it can speak to you. And even if we find an object from 2,000 years ago, as a scientist, we just see it as a potsherd or something to cook from. But when you closely look to it, you often see the fingerprints of the people who have made it. And when you go deeper into it, you see the story of the object. You have to use your imagination, your creativity, things that we have in common with our ancestors, that are not bound to a specific culture or a specific period of time. And that are the common grounds and the things we have to look for in heritage to make things back to life. let's say that way, to give it a new story often also, to go away from the things we used to do with it and to make it something for the future.
I think since mankind exists, we tell stories. And I think our forefathers told stories about where the mammoth was, or where I could find that deer. And so it's, yes, and they found out about the heritage of the migration of animals. And so they would always go there. And for hundreds of years would go, return in the autumn to this part of the world in order to get food. And they would tell about this, of course, to the kids. And they would have the knowledge. So to me, it's intertwined. And then if you go, I just remember a trickster story. It's an African trickster. He's called Anansi. Anansi is actually the original of Spider-Man. And but there are stories about Anansi becoming very small and hiding under stones. But in parts of Africa, if you lift stones, you have poisonous spiders underneath. So you learn as a kid, don't touch those. But you learn it through images, you learn it through a character, and thus you obey. Otherwise, if you would say, hey, don't touch the stones, what would you do as a child? You would, of course, go and touch the stone. And so this is, for me, a heritage as well.
I made a show about a village I lived in 10 years ago, and they asked me to do something about the history of the village, which was connected to a factory where they made cigars. And so I went to people in the village who have been working there. The factory was closed in the 80s, went down, everything broke, and the village collapsed, the shops closed, anybody had work after that, in that period. And so I went to the people and they told me their experiences, they told me about their work, they told me about what they had to do, about the conditions of work. And so these stories were real stories, it's an oral heritage, and I made stories out of it. So that's the answer to your question. So they told me in their way, I did that and I had to do that, and I had to go to the pharmacist to buy a product because I couldn't sleep anymore because I had to work too hard, blah, 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 blah. And then I made a show out of it, and people afterwards say, yeah, we just saw the village back as it was 40 years ago.
In last years we got so many immigrants coming, and that's completely new for Finnish society. And now these immigrants are telling their stories from their background, and also they're telling stories from their life in Helsinki, in Finland today. And this connection or meeting with the Finnish people and these stories from immigrant background, I think it's changing all the time. And the stories or the Finnish heritage at the same time is also changing with those stories. And there's possibility that some things are changing more open.
Storytelling remembers. And remembering means also being proud without fearing the others. And now that so many people are coming from all over the world, I think it's important to know who you are and that the others have also history, to know the history of the others and to see how beautiful they are. How important, wonderful, different, but still important and worth of respect.